The War for Mansoul by John Bunyan, as told by Ethel Barrett, copyright 1998, Christian Light Publications Incorporated, Harrisonburg, Virginia. Diabolus attacks again. The curfew had rung in Mansoul. The people had long been in their houses. The shades were drawn. There was no moon and the streets were poorly lighted. Most of the street lamps had been damaged. A chill wind swept the market square and worried the shutters on the castle windows. Sometimes it seemed to be running anxiously through the streets and up the alleys. Sometimes it seemed to disintegrate into one big, shuddering sob. The wind caught the robe of the lone figure walking along one of the side streets, now pulling it out behind him, now trying to wrap it around his ankles. He walked on, oblivious to the tug and push, his glance darting from alley to window to crevice to bush, as trying to ferret out anything that might be hiding. His face was sharp and intelligent, his eyes inquisitive, and there was an urgency in his step and manner. He was out walking because he had not been able to sleep, a malady that had plagued him all his life. "Mr. Prywell," his servants would say, "it is dangerous to take these walks so late at night. Mansoul is so dark and the wind is so chill, you'll catch your death." But old Prywell would lie upon his bed, far after everyone else had gone to sleep, unable to close an eye. In the end, he would succumb to his restlessness and sneak out to wander the dark streets to pry. For Prywell was a great lover of Mansoul and jealous for its well-being. He was always fearing some mischief would befall it, either of the diabolins within or from some power without. King Shaddai had made him this way. Indeed, it was the great king himself who planted these thoughts in Prywell's mind. The next street sign was in darkness, but Prywell knew it by heart. It was Vile Hill. He had prowled up that way often. He turned the corner and walked sonorously past the dark houses. He was nearly past Mischief's house when he saw the long, thin shaft of light reflected on the hedge. He stopped, looked, and backed up a few paces. It was coming from a slit in improvised drape drawn over a basement window. He crawled through the hedge and slithered on his belly up to the window and waited. There was no sound at first. Then he heard the voices inside. Evil voices, bragging, laughing, telling of the plot to weaken Mansoul within, letters flying back and forth between Mansoul and the pit, diabolins hiring out his servants under assumed names, seducing, undermining, lying, destroying, and an army, at least 20,000 strong, led by Diabolus himself, an army of hand-picked doubters, already on the way. Prywell listened until it was almost dawn. Then he made a run for it across the dangerous lighted space back to the hedge. He crawled through and sneaked back down Vile Hill, keeping to the shadows. After he turned the corner, he ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty streets, clear across town until he came to the house of Lord Mayor Understanding. He ran up to the huge front doors and pounded loudly with both fists. It was some time before he heard footsteps inside. Then, after the sound of considerable fussing with doors and locks and bolts and bars on the inside, the door opened a little way, and a servant in a nightcap poked his head out. "Yes?" he said, with some annoyance. "The mayor!" cried Prywell. "I must see the mayor." "Have you an appointment?" said the servant, gaping stupidly. "Appointment? No, I don't have an appointment, but I must see him." "But he's barely up yet, and he hasn't had his breakfast," protested the servant. "When he hears what I have to tell him, he won't want any breakfast," shouted Prywell. The servant opened the door the rest of the way, and Prywell dashed into the hallway. The servant started down the hall, shuffling and reluctant. "It's urgent!" bellowed Prywell. The servant lunged forward as if the words had given him a shove, and hurried toward the stairway. An hour later, Understanding and the other gentlemen he had hurriedly summoned to the emergency meeting listened with pained faces as Prywell finished his tale. "A wholesale massacre," said Understanding. "And we're playing right into their hands," said Conscience. "At least now we know what we're fighting," said Will. "What shall we do?" "Plenty," said Conscience, and he stood up. "My Lord Mayor, with your permission, I'll have the lecture bell rung. I'll speak to the people. And you, Mr. Prywell, you ought to speak to them too. Tell them firsthand what you saw, what you heard, and we'll go on from there." They got busy then with bell cords, notes, messengers, and hurried conferences. "Breakfast, sir?" asked the servant, poking his head in. "No breakfast," said the mayor. Already the lecture bell was ringing. The market square was crowded. The people came tumbling out of their houses in response to the lecture bell, and stood huddled together in a chill wind to hear what Conscience had to say. He told them the enemy, both inside and outside, was plotting their ruin. He painted a vivid and a horrible picture of the dispatches flying back and forth between the den of Mr. Mischief and the princes of the pit. He warned them to renew their guard and be watchful. He told them the Diabolans were just waiting for a market day to catch them unawares. And he told them it was past time for deceiving themselves. It was time to call a spade a spade. They were weak and sick and faint. They were sending petitions to Emmanuel and courting Diabolans in their midst. It was time to face up to the facts. It was time to clean up. Then he told them of the army of doubters being assembled to march against them, and called on Prywell to substantiate his words. When they finished speaking, the crowd stood absolutely silent for a moment. Then they wept. The effort to reform was all out, very courageous, and pitiful. All gates were locked and guarded. No one was allowed to come or go without being searched. Mr. Prywell was sent on a special secret mission to Hellgate Hill to spy on the enemy's doings. The patrols polished their buttons and badges and made a house-to-house search for lurking Diabolans and rooted them out. Those harboring Diabolans were brought to the market square to make public confession. Some of us humiliating, for many harboring the culprits were citizens in high office. In the very house of Mr. Mind and in the house of the great Lord Wilby-Will, 2 of them were found, Prudent Thrifty, alias Mr. Covetousness, and Harmless Mirth, alias Lasciviousness. They were committed to custody under Mr. Trueman, who handled them so severely that they died in prison. But for the most part, the Diabolans were almost impossible to capture. The captains and elders sought them diligently in dens and caves and holes and crevices, but though they could plainly see their footings and follow their tracks and smell their abodes, the culprits would still slip away, because their ways were so crooked, their holds so strong, and they so quick and nimble to slip from the grasp and take sanctuary until it was safe to come out again. A day of public confession of faults and fasting was declared. The captains drilled their men in maneuvers and put them back on a proper diet. There were clean-up days and clean-up weeks and rallies and revivals. They were as ready as they could be, wide awake, braced for action, and very, very frightened when the report came back from Prywell's intelligence corps. Diabolus was ready to march. And that old renegade, the worst of the lot who had escaped execution during those first days, was the general of the army, Old Unbelief. The people of Mansoul trembled. They were weak, and they knew it. They were weak, but now they were awake. The dreaded army came like a cloud on the horizon at first. Then it took shape. Soldiers, thousands of them. There seemed to be no end to them, coming on inexorably. They were a terrible sight to behold. Election doubters under Captain Rage. His colors were red. His standard-bearer was Mr. Destruction, and his emblem was a red dragon. Vocation doubters under Captain Fury. His colors were pale. His standard-bearer was Mr. Darkness, and his emblem was the fiery flying serpent. Grace doubters under Captain Damnation. His colors were red. His standard-bearer was Mr. No-Life, and his emblem was the black den. Faith doubters under Captain Insatiable. His colors were red. His standard-bearer was Mr. Devourer, and his emblem the yawning jaws. Perseverance doubters under Captain Brimstone. His colors were red. His standard-bearer was Mr. Burning, and his emblem was a blue and yellow flame. Resurrection doubters under Captain Torment. His colors were pale. His standard-bearer was Mr. Gnaw, and his emblem the black worm. Salvation doubters under Captain No Ease. His colors were red. His standard-bearer was Mr. Restless, and his emblem the Prince of Death. Glory doubters under Captain Sepulture. His colors were pale. His standard-bearer was Mr. Corruption, and his emblem a skull and dead men's bones. Joy doubters under Captain Past Hope. His colors were red. His standard-bearer was Mr. Despair, and his emblem a hot iron and a hard heart. These were the captains, and these were their forces, with their standards and their colors and their emblems. Over them were Lord Beelzebub and Lucifer, and Legion and Apollyon and Pylon and Cerberus and Belial. But over them all was unbelief. and Diabolus was their king.